Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm Emilie de Rosenroll, and I'm the CEO of COAST, the Center of Ocean Applied Sustainable Technologies. And I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. And today we're thrilled to welcome some internationally recognized panelists whose expertise and work in the arena of global climate security and the health of our oceans are extremely highly regarded. So you're in for a real treat. Before I introduce you to our host, a little bit about us. We are COAST, the Center of Ocean Applied Sustainable Technologies, Pacific Canada's innovation hub and cluster focused on opportunities within the blue economy. As an organization in its catalyst phase, we've built some incredible momentum over the last year, working with early stage innovators and startups, as well as established companies. And we've got some exciting announcements coming up this year as we move closer to realizing our vision for a world-class ocean innovation cluster for Pacific Canada. Coast Talk series showcases international innovators, scientists, companies working hard to build a sustainable global ocean future for all of us, and we're excited for you to join the conversation. Our host today is Dr. Kate Moran of Ocean Networks Canada, and also one of COAST's founders and directors. Kate joined the University of Victoria in 2011 as a professor in the Faculty of Sciences and as a director of Neptune Canada. And in 2012, she was promoted to the position of president and CEO of Ocean Networks Canada. Since then, she's led and grown the organization by providing expertise and leadership that deliver ocean solutions to science, society, and industry. Kate co-led the first deep water drilling operation in the Arctic Ocean. This expedition successfully recovered the first paleoclimate record of the Arctic Ocean. And she also led one of the first offshore expeditions to investigate the seafloor following the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. Kate and her team are currently leading a climate mitigation solution project right here in BC called Solid Carbon. I could go on and on, but I promised Kate I would keep this short-ish. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Emilie. And if you could stop your share, I'll share my screen. Stand by for a second. I just have a couple slides to share as we go forward. Well, thank you so much, Emilie. And I'm happy to be here with these two experts. Just to remind everyone, Canada has the longest coastline in the world. And of course, most of us know that most of that coastline, as you can see in this image, is in the Arctic. And to kick this off, I just wanted to repeat some of the findings of a recent report done by the Center for Climate and Security, for which one of our panelists is a co-author. And in that report, it stated that even at scenarios of low warming from climate, each region of the world will face severe risks to national and global security in the next 3 decades. Highest levels of warming will pose catastrophic and likely irreversible global security risks over the course of the 21st century. And a key finding of the study is, without concerted efforts of both climate change mitigation and adaptation, we risk high impact and catastrophic threats to our collective and national security. And of course, because 70% of the planet is the ocean, we need to look to the ocean for taking these kind of concerted efforts. And these results from this report and many other reports raise the priority for climate action to the highest possible level. And in Canada, we must do our part. And at Ocean Networks Canada, as you can see from this diagram, we have observations on all 3 coasts of Canada, and we are working on activities that are using technology to not only mitigate climate mitigation strategies like solid carbon that Emilie mentioned, but also to begin to look at ways that we can adapt to climate change through coastal resilience. And of course, we're keenly interested to work with others, and especially our partners in the military, to advance observing of the Arctic. So from these solutions, from carbon dioxide removal solutions, to building coastal resilience, to adaptation for expanding situation awareness in the Arctic, I'm really delighted to lead off this discussion and introduce these 2 exceptional experts. I'll stop sharing there for a second. Stand by. There we go. So our first speaker, I'm really delighted to see Sherri Goodman again. Sherri Goodman is a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute, and Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She is credited with educating a generation of US military and government officials about the nexus between climate change and national security, using her famous coinage, threat multiplier, to fundamentally reshape the national discourse on the topic. Sherri serves as Vice Chair of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and on the Ex-Im Bank's Council on Climate. A former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, she has founded, led, or advised nearly a dozen research organizations on environmental and energy matters, national security, and public policy. And of course, because of this nexus of climate change and security, it's really an honor to have Sherri speak with us today. Over to you, Sherri.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I think the work that you're doing is incredibly important. I appreciate that generous introduction. I've spent a lot of my time actually working in and around the oceans. That's how I really got started. I started out as a national security and defense professional, but I say my career went from weapons to waste when I found myself cleaning up the nuclear weapons complex in the United States when I served on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And after that, as a lawyer, I practiced environmental law, but one of my primary clients turned out to be the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which I know all you ocean experts are familiar with, and I have worked with them ever since. I've been on their board, and I've served as their lawyer a long time ago, but and then I ran something called the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which you probably all were members of, or many of your companies or your oceanographic organization. So I have a deep love of the ocean. And although I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., my favorite place to be is Cape Cod, whereas you could find me in the summertime, so along the ocean. So I care deeply about the blue economy, about clean technologies, and about climate change. So I'm going to give you just a brief kind of story about the history here of climate and security, and then just share with you a little bit on ocean tech for climate security from my own perspective in the US, but I'm looking forward to learning from you because I think you're all deep into this and there's lots happening in this field. Okay, next slide. So I'm affiliated both with the Center for Climate Security and the Wilson Center and a number of others. Okay, so the story I like to tell is that over the last several decades, we've had a convergence of national security, climate, and environmental security. So if you look on the top, at the top line, you see the progression and national security events from the Cold War through to 9/11, and then into the COVID era and terrorism, and now beyond. And at the same time, you've had the growth both of environmental laws in the US, but also in Canada, and international environmental regimes, from the Montreal Protocol to the creation of the IPCC, to a great deal of climate action over the last couple of decades. And now you see that it's really, in many ways, across our national security community, very integrated. And you see that in a number of the documents that this administration has threaded climate strategy across the Defense Department, intelligence community, state, sort of everywhere in national security. Next slide. It really got started in the 2007 with the first group of US generals and admirals. I'm so pleased that we have Vice-Admiral Angus Topshee here with us today, because I think that military operational understanding of the nexus between climate and security is so fundamentally essential. I gathered the first group of 3- and 4-star US generals and admirals in 2006 and 2007. They had served as Chief of Staff of the US Army and combatant commanders in Pacific Command, Central Command, head of the US Nuclear Navy. We spent a year of study learning from the world's leading climate scientists and others, and we released this first report in 2007, which has been followed by many more by many other organizations since then. But we declared, and I think it's still true, that climate change is a serious threat to America's just global security, not just US, and that it acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. We see tensions even in stable regions, and there's a great deal of nexus driven home to us even more so since Putin's war in Ukraine and the weaponization of energy there, that climate change, national security, and energy dependence are a related set of global challenges. Next slide, please. And so what are those climate threat multipliers? You know them. This is really just a refresher, and there are more. You know, temperatures have risen dramatically over the last half century, nowhere more so than the Arctic, of which, you know, Canada has a lot of. And so we see temperature rise as high as 4 degrees on average in much of the Arctic now. We've got pervasive drought across much of the mid-latitudes, the equatorial areas, but even others. We've got fires year-round. You know, in the US, the head of the National Guard that deploys forces to combat fires in the Northwest, now Southwest, and other parts, says it's no longer just a fire season, it's fire year-round. We've got sea level rise threatening major megacities and other coastal regions around the world. You experience that. Massive flooding. We're having that now in Southern California, in parts of California with the atmospheric rivers, you know, flooding plus combined with snow, heavy snow in the mountains, and then the extreme weather events. And I could add more like permafrost thaw and collapse, and there are others, but just to give you a background. Next slide. So all these physical threat multipliers interact with other factors, and that's why you have this destabilizing toxic brew, because, you know, we've had in my lifetime now growing, I mean, in many parts of the world, you've had some improvement in poverty, but in many other areas, you've got demographic growth, particularly in Africa, combined with increasing inequality. You've got many fragile states with poor governance that create the fertile ground for violent extremists to exploit, and then growing human displacement and climate migration. So these all are exacerbated by continuing drought, sea level rise, warming oceans, storm surges, heat waves, etc. Next slide. Okay. So now I'll just give you a little bit of, you know, why we're talking here. You guys are in the ocean, you know, working on the blue economy and ocean technologies. And of course, climate change is a triple threat for the ocean. Not only do we have warmer oceans, but less oxygen, more acidic. You've got sea level rise, bleaching, toxic algae blooms, which affect where around my area on Cape Cod, it's getting worse. Habitats, you know, we've got both combined with illegal and unregulated fishing, also worsened habitats for fish, marine mammals, acidification, destroying many of the shellfish, natural shellfish areas, and then, of course, the fisheries. So what can we do about it? I'm eager to learn what you all are doing about it, but I'll share with you on the next slide a couple of technologies with which I'm familiar that are used both in the US and internationally, both by our US Navy and by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and others, to improve our observations and data to understand the changing, you know, to understand how climate change is affecting oceans. So you've got the Argo floats that measure a variety of parameters in the ocean that are helping us understand ocean's response to climate change. They're deployed widely, and they are very important. We've got the CHANOS, which is the channelized optical system that can take rapid measurements of the ocean's carbon chemistry, and scientists make some valuable observations of ocean chemistry. in response to climate change. You've got these ice tethered profilers, which are these bright yellow surface buoys sitting atop ice flows. Like they look like construction barrels on a snow-covered highway. They're tracking ocean parameters around the clock. And along with ship-based observations, you could quantify changes over past several decades and to understand the speed and the scale of ocean warming. And here are a couple of others on the next slide that I think are, on the next slide, you've got, the Polar Sentinel, which is a autonomous underwater vehicle glider. We've got lots of gliders out there now that can travel thousands of miles below the surface of the Arctic Ocean to measure ice thickness. And that's very cool. The sail drone, I don't know if you've seen those off your coast. I've been to their factory out there in where they build them in Alameda, close to San Francisco. And they're taking a variety of ocean measurements, hurricane related and others. They've got a lot of different capabilities for collection. Very cool application. And then you've got the deep sea, a towable sensor platform, and that's helping us identify the creatures in the ocean twilight zone, sort of an understudied area of the oceans. So, as you all know, we know a lot more about space than we know about the deep ocean and the ocean twilight zone. Kate and others, I know you live that every day, and I always find that. I met with our head of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, Rick Spinrad, just last week, an old friend, and we always try to find more ways to get more investment in ocean observations and the blue economy. I've long thought it's been somewhat under-resourced in the US, but the good news is that with heightened attention to the growing need to combat climate change, we've had some greater investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act in the US to work with you all. Particularly, I think what you're doing is so important. And I think I'll end by saying the next week I'm going to be in Montreal to keynote a NATO conference on climate security at their new NATO Climate and Security Center. And I think that, Canada has I'm really proud of Canada's leadership in this area. I think it's so important. And I hope that we will have more opportunities to work together to make the world better for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherri. That was a wonderful highlight of both the threat, but also some of the technologies that are being implemented. As you said, some of those that you showed, we also have been using some of those here in Canada, but also creating our own versions of them, but almost identical to what you described. And of course, we're very interested in taking those data that are captured to develop what we call data products here at Ocean Hours Canada for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So thank you for that, for kicking that off. It provides a rich fodder for questions and discussion. I'd like to turn it over now to introduce Vice-Admiral Angus Topshee. He is the 38th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. His diverse academic background includes military and civilian institutions on 3 continents. Highlights of his time at sea include his command of the HMCS Algonquin and 3 years in command of Canada's Pacific Fleet. Vice-Admiral Topshee's shore postings include the Navy's Strategy Directorate, Command of Canadian Forces Base Halifax, and Deputy Director, Strategy, Policy, and Plans at NORAD, and United States Northern Command Headquarters in Colorado Springs. He also deployed to Afghanistan in 2011 as the Director of Afghan National Police Training within the NATO training mission Afghanistan. Over the course of his career, he has been involved in Arctic issues as well at almost every one of his shore postings. Before taking command of the Royal Canadian Navy in 2022, Vice Admiral Topshee commanded Maritime Forces Pacific and Joint Task Force Pacific in Esquimalt. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Vice Admiral Angus Topshee.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. And Sherri, I was really impressed with the presentation you've done there. Hopefully I'm going to contribute to the discussion by really highlighting a number of points today. First, the Royal Canadian Navy has always benefited from the fantastic work of our science and industry in the ocean environment. We have world-leading acoustic technologists, scientists. That equipment benefits us on our ships, and we certainly leverage the knowledge that's generated in all of our operations in Canadian waters and abroad. Also wanted to touch a little bit on sort of our picture around Canada, what we're seeing right now in terms of the things that we're learning from interactions, and finally talk a bit about picking up on the point Sherri made so clearly, that these days climate has a direct impact on security, and we're taking a much more holistic look at security. So in terms of the scientific underpinnings of the work that we do, we're very conscious, as Kate pointed out, that Canada has the world's longest coastline. And in fact, we're a nation that has 3 oceans around it. We're all very familiar in Canada with the Atlantic. Increasingly, we're becoming aware of the Pacific, and there's a deep emotional connection to the Arctic, but often most Canadians really don't fully appreciate the environment, and very few have ever traveled up there. One of the things that is striking about the Arctic when you have the chance to operate up there is just how little we actually know about that environment. Less than 10% of the Arctic is surveyed to modern standards, which has implications for us, as we're seeing with the ice retreating in the summer navigation season. More and more people are making their way up into the Arctic, exploring parts of the Arctic that many ships haven't often gone to before. And without the survey data, there's a greater risk of incident happening up there, things that could bring vulnerabilities or environmental consequences to the very small isolated communities in the high north and to the pristine Arctic environment. So working with our partners and the rest of government, and in particular Coast Guard and Transport Canada, we're paying close attention to that region to make sure we're aware of everything that's happening up there. And again, back to world-leading technology, it's not just about the sensors that are in and on the ocean. The space-based sensors that Canada deploys are a fantastic part of the solution for us in terms of understanding what's happening in our environment. And we work very closely to make sure that we're tracking the impacts of climate change. In fact, I think it's 2 years ago now, one of our Harry DeWolf class of new Arctic and offshore patrol vessels transited through the Northwest Passage. It's the first time a Canadian Navy ship had gone through the Northwest Passage since the 1950s. And as they went through, they interacted with a number of Indigenous communities across the high north. The number one takeaway we had from that voyage was the impact that they were seeing of climate change and how it was changing their daily life, how it was changing their understanding of where species could be found, what sort of hunts were sustainable, fisheries that were coming from different parts. They were seeing fish that they'd never seen before as they move up into the warming waters of the Arctic. And so this is of interest to us because we have seen around the world that countries have a tendency to pursue fish wherever they may be found. And we are very concerned, even though there's right now an agreement on a moratorium on fishing in the high Arctic, in the international waters, we're concerned that that may not last or may not stand. And so we really want to make sure that we're tracking that and aware of what's happening up in that part of the world. And so that's the scientific side of things. In terms of what we're doing, I'll divide that up into 2 parts. And so first of all, first and foremost, around national security and in Canada, the biggest thing that the Canadian Navy has brought to bear recently is the delivery of those new Arctic and offshore patrol vessels. The Harry DeWolf class is an incredible ship. It's 7,000 tons. It's a polar class 4 ship. It is designed to be able to break first-year ice. It's intended to travel throughout the archipelago in the navigation season. So that's really that July to September, October timeframe that we'll be able to operate anywhere up in the high Arctic at that point. And then in the Arctic approaches the rest of the year. What that ship brings is it is one of His Majesty's Canadian ships, so a warship in that sense, but it's a non-combatant. It's not designed to go into battle. It's designed really to make sure that we are able to understand the environment and contribute from a whole government context. So it's deliberately designed with connectors, the ships and helicopter capability to allow it to meet with the local communities, to embark scientists from both other government departments and from national institutes like Ocean Network Canada and other places. We can work with private industry. We want to make sure that we're able to bring capacity to bear wherever it needs to contribute to that greater understanding of security and to make sure that we can help mitigate the impacts of climate change, because we're definitely seeing those in the high north. So that's a fantastic capability. We are in the midst of the largest recapitalization in the Canadian Navy's history outside of wartime. So that will include delivering a new joint support ship, so a refueling ship that will also have the ability to operate in proximity to Arctic ice, as well, the replacement to the Victoria-class submarine will be designed to operate in the Arctic approaches in the high north of Canada. And so that project is making sure that if we ever needed to provide that guaranteed ability to defend our waters against any threat, we will have it in the Canadian Navy. And we can do it. All of our operations in the Arctic are designed to be as low footprint as possible to make sure that we don't do anything to harm that pristine environment, because we recognize the importance of being able to operate in a sustainable manner. I'll also note that we consider the high Arctic to be an expeditionary theater, meaning that we know that whenever we deploy up there, we have to bring with us everything that we will require to be able to operate successfully. We can't count on the local communities to resupply us as we might in the rest of the world, because they don't have the capacity to do so. And in fact, it's already a burden on them to just get their own food, fuel, and other supplies up to them each and every year. And so the last thing we want to do is become a burden on the local communities as we seek to better understand and operate in that environment. And the last piece I wanted to touch on is the broader picture of climate security and climate impacts. And like I said, Sherri did a fantastic job of drawing the link between climate change and human security. We're really seeing, as we do operations around the world, that many nations are feeling the impacts of climate change right now, and not just in terms of the increase that we see in natural disasters and climate-driven phenomena, but also in the sort of impact of changes to the fisheries, changes to ocean conditions, the threat of rising sea levels. As I talk to my counterparts in Indian and Pacific, in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, many of the smaller countries don't regard sort of great power competition as the foremost security threat. They see climate change as the existential threat that they're facing, and they're looking to us to help them address that. So part of that involves us making sure, again, we understand what the impacts of climate change are. We're able to help build resilience against those impacts, that we are able to, when necessary, help mitigate the impacts through direct disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. But more importantly, that we're in position to deal with things like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Because right now we know, because we've got, again, some of the world leaders in terms of science and understanding fisheries globally, that we are seeing profound impacts on fisheries around the world, to the point where many of the stocks today are challenged by overexploitation. And understanding that process, assisting nations with taking care of policing their exclusive economic zones, making sure that the fisheries around their waters are regulated and sustainable, all of that is very important, because that touches directly on human security. That's a big part of what, food security is not just about what's grown on land, it's about what comes from the seas, because so many of the people of the world depend on protein being coming out of the world's oceans. So there's a lot of work that we're doing in cooperation, again, with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and other government departments in Global Affairs Canada, here in Canada, but also with partners around the world, like the US Coast Guard, the US Navy, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, a lot of the South Pacific nations that we're working with to really better understand that problem and see how we can work together to address the challenges that we see today. So that is a very quick overview. I apologize that I didn't bring the really beautiful slides that both Kate and Sherri had. And I look forward to the discussion of these issues, because it is really an important topic and one that's very near and dear to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice-Admiral Topshee. And I'll turn it now back over to Emilie to oversee the Q&A part of the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, and everyone. That was, such a fascinating topic. I have so many questions. I'm going to kick us off with just a couple, and then open it up to the audience for their questions as well. But one thing just to sort of kick us off, last year in British Columbia, I'll root it here in British Columbia, we suffered from several major climate disasters that made it very real to us here, from extreme severe floods and landslides, a heat dome that killed hundreds, and uncontrollable forest fires that displaced thousands and raised an entire community. So we're starting to really feel the reality and the costs, the human costs, the infrastructure costs, and so on of these severe weather occurrences. When I read your security threat assessment, and a lot of it's quite alarming. In British Columbia or in Canada in general, what sort of threat level or scenario do you think we should be realistically planning for? And maybe I'll open it up with Sherri and then move it on to others on the panel.
Okay, thank you so much, Emilie. I mean, you are in a region that obviously is facing, like many others, growing climate intensity, from the wildfires to the heat domes and sea level rise and ocean acidification. And at the same time, you are fortunate that I think have one of the most, you're in a region that is among the most resilient in the world. I mean, I had the privilege of speaking at the Cascadia Innovation Summit last fall, convened by your premier and the governors of Washington State and Oregon, and along with many other business leaders, and Bill Gates, and a lot of your leaders were there. And the investment that is being put into improving the resilience of both the physical infrastructure in the region, from ports and roads and rail, to the human infrastructure and the awareness and the movement to net zero, is remarkable. I do think, the question of what do we plan for? I mean, we're not on track to meet the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. We'll be fortunate if we can hold it to 2 degrees. That's we're probably not, we'd have to do a lot to move towards net zero in the next quarter century to sort of hold ourselves down there. But I think we're on track to somewhere between an average global temperature rise of 1.5 to 2. With I said, in the Arctic regions, we're on track to, we already are experiencing over 4 degrees temperature rise, with parts of the Arctic, Russian Arctic, even Canadian Arctic, experiencing temperatures that weren't heard of in people's lifetimes, up in the 90s and 100 sometimes, on unique events. So I think we have to, it's always better, in military parlance, you always want to prepare for the worst case, recognizing that, no plan ever, survives first contact with the enemy. We also say that in the Cold War, we thought about a nuclear attack as between the US and the Soviet Union as a low probability but high consequence event that was worth investing billions of US, Canadian, other GDP to defend and deter. Right, we were successful. We won the Cold War, and now we find ourselves in a new age, from the nuclear age to the climate age, where we have in climate a high probability and high consequence event. So we need to become resilient and prepare. And I would say that fortunately you're in a region that is more well situated, of course, though you're not immune from global effects. So we have, as the Admiral quite rightly said, we've got to be attentive and sensitive to many other regions of the world that are much more climate vulnerable.
Great point. Vice-Admiral Topshee, do you want to also lend us your perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. And first and foremost, as I look at the Navy, we've got our 2 main bases in Halifax and in Victoria on both coasts. One of our first considerations has been making sure that those bases are resilient against what we're seeing, because the old idea of a 100-year storm is happening much more frequently than that. So is our infrastructure ready to deal with all of that? And then the second part of that is our job in the Canadian Armed Forces is to be a force of last resort to assist the Canadians when times of need. And so we're seeing increasingly a demand on us to provide forces to support, whether it's wildfires in the BC interior, floods in BC. We saw the consequences of Hurricane Fiona on the East Coast last year. And we're really understanding the particular vulnerability of some of the isolated communities of Canada. So making sure that we have the capacity to respond to that. And that's really more of a national discussion, I think, that needs to happen in Canada, because the military is available and convenient for that, but often not the best resource to use in those ways. And so how do we make sure that provinces and territories, municipalities are building the resilience that they need to be able to take care of those problems? So I think that's an important discussion that has to happen at some point. And then the final piece of this is, just as Sherri has highlighted, the impacts of climate change are going to be felt in different ways in different parts of the world and can be a source of tension. how do we make sure that we're in a position to help ensure that we can find peaceful ways to adjudicate these disputes and avoid a recourse to war and to conflict. And we also have to remember that fundamentally our job is to be ready to defend Canada and the continent here at home. And there are, as we look at how the security situation is changing, I thought, Sherri's graph that shows that connection between, sort of the perception of the importance of climate and then that sort of more traditional perspective of security, those are aligning closer and closer all of the time. I think we're very conscious of that. So our need to be able to stand up for a rules-based international order that is determined to tackle these challenges in a meaningful way is something that's really important as well. So thanks.
Those are phenomenal points. Kate, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Of course, I agree. I think our region has been hit by pretty extreme events, but we have demonstrated because of our highly skilled labor force and the knowledge we have that we went through and are continuing to go through a recovery, and we're learning from that. And that's all in the space of adaptation, as has been talked about. So I think one of the things about adaptation is, as Ocean Networks Canada, we partner with local companies to develop new adaptation tools. And I think that's something that is not only important for us to protect our own coastline and our own infrastructure, but it's exportable. So it sits in the coast space. And so I think I'd encourage everyone, if anyone has any other interest in adaptation tools in the coastline, I'm happy to chat with you about those potential commercial products, because they're going to be needed all over the world. But I'd like to emphasize what Sherri talked about in the beginning, is that we also have to work together with other countries, especially the rich Western countries, to mitigate. And that means obviously decarbonizing, which we're doing great in BC, but we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I mean, as Sherri said, in order for us to keep us even just below 2, it's clear from scientific research, we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And so as for those of you who are interested, we're trying to advance this project called Solid Carbon, which would combine direct air capture and sequestration into ocean basalt. Expensive, but one of the most durable and secure mitigation strategies. But also, as NOAA and other organizations in the United States, including Ocean Visions and Ocean Networks Canada, we're also looking at enhancing the natural processes in the ocean for removing additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Early stages, but I think it's because of this security threat, we have to begin to work on these mitigation strategies as well as the important adaptation strategies.
Thank you, Kate. I'm glad you went there, because we can focus a lot on the sort of opportunity costs of not doing something to our infrastructure, institutions, geopolitical order, and so on. But the solution set, I know a lot of our audience likes to focus on what they can do to make a difference. So the commercial opportunities are very interesting. I just want to give the rest of the panel an opportunity to comment as well on how the private sector can also help us meet some of these targets and take advantage also of the opportunities afforded by climate challenges and crises. Maybe Sherri first. You've already mentioned a little bit on the blue economy opportunities. Do you want to develop that a little further?
Sure. I mean, the blue economy, which is already a term widely used in your region and in certain parts of the US, I think is going to gain a lot more traction and recognition in coming decades, because we not only recognize the so vast resource of the ocean, some of which are being overly depleted, like the fish in certain areas, but we also recognize the importance of a healthy ocean for sustainability. And I think that, to me, that's what the concept of the blue economy kind of combines, the sustainable with the oceans and the economics. And I think you're thinking about it probably in your region in quite the right way. I want to underscore a point Kate made too. When we think about how we cope with climate threats, there traditionally people thought about 2 ways, thought about we need to mitigate. In other words, we need to reduce the amount of carbon we put in the atmosphere. Those are all the targets in the Paris Agreement, bring down our emissions. And then people said we need to adapt and become resilient. So much climate is already baked in, we have to be resilient. But Kate, you talked about some efforts in the ocean that are, what are called today sort of climate intervention technologies. I've been part of a workshop the last couple of days at the Lawrence Livermore Labs, which is looking at the whole suite of climate intervention technologies and how we kind of understand that. And I did a project last year on governing climate intervention technologies. And I'd say this is really the third area that's under-examined. The technology work is actually in some ways proceeding, and the research and development proceeding faster than the governance, because we don't fully understand how we would govern it at a global or yet a national level. There are some fears, as there were a decade ago, about, well, we can't focus on climate resilience because otherwise we won't mitigate. And now we realize you have to do both. You have to walk and chew gum. And the same is true for, and I think we need to rename it. Climate intervention sounds a little scary, so people don't like it. So we're going to have to come up with a new name to talk about, because in many ways, these are techniques. Some are very invasive and some are less, and some are across the board. And there's a lot of the different types, but some of them are very protective. And so we need to understand and perhaps be able to distinguish those, but also understand where they're going to have unintended consequences, so that we understand and can avoid those, but still get the benefits of the climate protective technologies as we move down this sphere of trying to remove carbon and CO2 either from the oceans or the atmosphere.
Climate protective, that's already a better way of describing it. I agree with the power of words to motivate people. Vice-Admiral, did you want to cover that as well?
Well, just very quickly to say that, we're not going to solve the problem of climate change in the Canadian Navy, but we certainly are working all of the time to minimize our footprint to it and make sure that we're seizing whatever opportunities we can. Because as it's been pointed out, it's a matter of both, tackling it from whatever manner you can at any point. We're very conscious of our carbon footprint. All navies are these days. It's always been a military operational requirement that the more fossil fuels you use, the harder it is to sustain, the longer the logistics tail you need. So we've always had an interest in figuring out how to do that better. I've been amazed throughout my career. We take 250 people to sea with us on one of our frigates. The amount of packaging that goes with simple things like food, and the processing that's involved in creating that packaging, then disposing of that packaging and all of that stuff. So we're working with suppliers to try and figure out innovative ways to reduce that, to do things differently, that while preserving the ability to store food for long term. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of really interesting innovation around simple things that simple technologies that we don't think of very often. How you recover oily waste and process that so that you can put the water back over the side. Some really remarkable technology coming from Canadian companies. And over the course of my career, when I first joined, we didn't really take showers very frequently at sea, because the only way you could make drinking water was through an evaporator run off a steam boiler plant. It was a huge pain. It produced very little water at great power expense. And so we used it very, very carefully. Nowadays, we've got reverse osmosis distillation plants that produce huge quantities of fresh water for very, very little power use. And that's changed sort of our understanding of, we can do things very differently. And that's the type of win-win that we look to technology to provide us. So low-level innovation is really the key as we try and embrace different ways to reduce our impact on things. And I think that the more we can adopt those in society using the scale sometimes that the military can bring, the better off we will all be, because it just makes those technologies easier to adopt across society.
Thank you. Innovation for showering, we're all supportive of that as well. Okay, great. I'm glad you brought up supply chain, because we have a good question here that builds on the supply chain question from Allison, who's a journalist here at the Victoria Tech Journal. She's curious if the panelists have any thoughts regarding Biden's recent approval of the Willow Project and its impacts on Canadian climate, impacts on security. And also, I think tying to Sherri brought up some discussion around the supply chain opportunities with the IRA Act, or Inflation Reduction Act, and whether or not those pose opportunities. Maybe two parts to that question. Sherri, do you mind kicking us off with that one?
So look, let's be honest here. I think if the Biden administration, if they could have not approved the Willow Project, they would have done so. but the lease had been granted back in the 90s, and they felt that the legal implication, they would have been likely overturned. And so what they did, in order to minimize it, they already reduced its scope from 3 pads to 2, or for whatever, they reduced the scope. And then they added a bunch of other protections outside the Willow project that they thought were equally important. So no offshore Arctic drilling, other protections in the region. So they're trying to do as much as they can. I don't think, it seems very likely that, this is going to be one of the last major projects approved in that region, but it was very important to the Alaska delegation. Let's just be honest, in American politics, Senator Murkowski and Senator Manchin, one's an R, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat, but they're both kind of very much at the center and we have a very closely divided Senate now, and a narrowly Republican House, and it's 2 years till an election, and I think they made some moves that clearly were motivated by their assessment of the domestic politics on this. That said, what are the particular impacts on on Canadian climate and security? Well, I mean, more drilling leads to more oil, and there could be, additional consequences. As I said, I don't know how quickly this is going to get underway. The last time there was, none of these projects have proceeded particularly expeditiously. So I think you should watch it, obviously, and be aware of it. I also think it could well be that this is, as we the transition from fossil to renewable isn't like you turn off one and then start the other. It's kind of, as the one's going down, the other's coming up, but you've got an overlap here, and I think we're in that period of the energy transition where we've got to minimize, and I would be, if I were you and others, working to minimize all the air and other consequences of any kind of drilling project, and releases, methane releases. Certainly that all can be built in so that it's as environmentally sound as possible, recognizing what kind of project it is, and then be looking to the future and to enhance those protections. And, US and Canada have always worked closely, and the US is very attentive to Canadian concerns. So that's also important.
Thank you. I'll give an opportunity if the other panelists want to pick up any of those threads of that theme. Yeah, Kate?
Yeah, I totally, that was a wonderful answer, Sherri. I just think that was really helpful to explain that, the political, tightrope you can get into for making these decisions. But one of the important things I think we're seeing in that transition is that with the war in Ukraine, we actually saw a huge transition in Europe from gas in a very short amount of time. And so when we're in these crisis situations, I do think, because of the length of time it takes to build these projects, by the time it's ready to be potentially in production, I think the economics won't be there. That's a guess, but I'm just seeing that in terms of the future. I also want to just mention, in terms of technology, is that much of the technology that's already been developed in offshore oil and gas can be repurposed for many of these ocean-based carbon dioxide removal solutions. So we already have the know-how and the skill set to actually help that industry move from extraction to, I always call it climate repair, but I like we have a lot of ways we can talk about it.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to think about the new supply chains that don't even exist yet, and those economic opportunities that are afforded. So this is a question that takes that from the audience, that takes it a little bit more to from the Navy's perspective. So Vice-Admiral, this is for you. How can smaller businesses or innovative startups in BC or Canada get more involved in ocean innovation and supply chain opportunities to solve the Navy's challenges? And also, can the Navy fund startups directly?
So there are some mechanisms through the Department of National Defense that allow us to sort of put money in towards innovation. And I'm afraid I'm not as familiar with those as I should be, but through the MINES program and some of the defense innovation hubs, there are real opportunities there. And the interesting thing is it allows us to invest in a proof of concept So if a company comes to us and says, hey, we've got this technology that we think can make a difference, then we're able to come up with a contracting mechanism to invest in that. And if it works, that's great. Unfortunately, there comes a point where in order to scale it, then it has to go through the normal sort of procurement process, which is, I'll be fully honest, very painful and quite process heavy. But if there are companies that are interested in doing that, the simplest thing to do is to try and reach out to the local base and fleet commanders to explore opportunities to see what the needs actually are on the ground. And as well, I'll ask that, you can certainly share my email address. And if people want to email me directly to get a better sense of that, we work with a number of different security and defense expeditions like CanSec to highlight these types of things. So those types of trade shows and conventions are great opportunities to get to meet the people who will actually make the decisions, because my contact information is fantastic, but at the end of the day, I very rarely sign a contract. Most of the time it's people who work for me, but we are trying to figure out ways to really create, to find the solutions that Canadian industry has done so well, and to actually, get through the process to be able to deliver those to the fleet and have an impact.
Let me just add, because I think, in many of the naval procurement processes in the US are open to Canadian and other companies as well. And for example, the Naval Undersea Warfare Centers are great sources of procurement of undersea, not just warfare, but observations. And a lot of the technologies we're talking about here, they come right, for example, I know the one that's up in Rhode Island because they work closely along with all the oceanographic institutions from the Woods Hole to University of Rhode Island, others, and Canadian ones all along the East Coast. I think there's one in the West Coast as well. I mean, they're situated regionally, and also the U.S. Office of Naval Research works very closely with the Canadian Navy in these areas, particularly in the Arctic.
Well, there's another question that picks up a little bit on this question around the cooperation side. And it's a little bit more oriented towards the Vice-Admiral, but the question is, how does the Canadian Navy work with other forces to develop global technologies and link vessels to air? So this audience member is thinking drones, for example.
Yeah, so there is a tremendous amount of cooperation with other navies. In fact, I was, just the other day in India, of all places, I was talking to the first Sea Lord, to the commander of the Royal Navy, about some of the technologies that they're exploring in terms of reducing their carbon footprint. As far as the use of uncrewed vehicles, we are actively exploring all of that. It's because that is the future. We see it very clearly in Ukraine, that where there's an opportunity to extend the range, and the awareness of a ship by employing something that goes in the air, on the water, under the water. It's amazing. Sherri showed a great photo of one of the underwater systems that is very effective in the Arctic. In fact, from my perspective, if I want to look for a submarine that might be operating in our Arctic waters, the easiest way to do that is to use an uncrewed system. So we're working quickly to explore all of those. There are a number of different relationships around the world. Five Eyes is the one that most people in that are aware of, that brings together the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada in an intelligence sharing, technology sharing arrangement. We are also working on similar information sharing arrangements with all of our other partners in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, NATO has an incredible hub for the 30, hopefully soon 32 members of NATO to share technology and to work together to coordinate systems like that. And we're seeing the benefit of that, to be honest, in Ukraine right now, because the ability to use common processes and technologies to help the Ukrainians in terms of the technology they need to defeat the Russians is a lot of that is built upon the sort of common NATO backbone.
Excellent. Well, we have still more questions here that we can probably answer in the time left here, but I'll throw another one in here. Actually, you'll be happy. I think the Navy will be very happy about this one. Do you recruit ocean scientists? So Vice-Admiral Topshee, do you recruit ocean scientists? And if so, how do we join?
So we are absolutely recruiting all sorts of people. So there's a number of different ways you can work as an ocean scientist. So if you're really interested in the pure science, the Defense Research and Development Canada, which has laboratories in a number of different places. There's a fantastic one, DRDC Atlantic in Dartmouth and Halifax. And so going on to the website there for canada.ca/defense, you'll be able to find that. The Navy, we're definitely hiring. We're about 1,400 sailors short. We're looking for people across the board. There are fantastic jobs in that, not a lot of them in pure research, but a lot of them leveraging science, technology, and engineering to make a difference. We are about to launch a program, in fact, on the 1st of April, to bring people in an expedited entry process, where if you're not sure what you'd like to do in the Navy, but you want to give it a test, we've got a 1-year entry program designed for young Canadians who aren't sure what they want to do with their lives. We'll give them, basically basic training for 8 weeks, some Navy specific training for 4 weeks, and then they'll have an opportunity to see all of the different jobs and opportunities, deploy with a ship somewhere in the world with, for a period of time and really experience the Navy. So we are hiring. We're very keen. So if you're interested, check us out and basically really just Google Canadian Forces recruiting/Navy.
Thank you. And we're throwing some resources now into the chat. The Navy is definitely hiring, and a lot of those jobs are located here in Greater Victoria. So I'm sure they're thrilled to hear that question. I have probably one last question, and then we'll be wrapping up here. Why this question is, maybe I'll start it with Kate. Why is it that research funds in the ocean sciences is low in Canada compared to other G8 countries, despite having the longest coastline in the world? And for an example here, the French Institute, IFREMER, that's a long acronym, IFREMER maybe, has 213 euros in a budget per year with almost no coastline compared to Canada. So I'm sure, Kate, you want to dig into that.
Sure. I think, well, I just want to correct it because the government over the last now 8 years has really made the biggest investment in terms of I call it applied ocean science and technology in the Oceans Protection Plan. And the next phase of that was just released. So I think that we have turned a corner, and the realization of the need for research and technology in the ocean is front and center now. And of course, Ocean Networks Canada has been benefiting from that funding to help not only our own ocean research and researchers from all over the world, in fact, but also, as I said in the beginning, to help be a platform for the development of new ocean technology. So I think we've turned the corner.
Yeah, well, that's a nice optimistic way to leave us off on this panel. It was such an engaging panel. I have more questions. I could keep us here all day, but many of us have to get on with the rest of our activities for the day. So thank you again to our host, Dr. Kate Moran, and our guests, Sherri Goodman and Vice-Admiral Topshee. We're going to be posting a recording of this event on our website at canadacoast.ca, and we'll soon announce our next Coast Talk event on April 12th, this time centered on the role of AI in promoting ocean technology and innovation. We encourage you to sign up for the Coast newsletter by visiting canadacoast.ca. And for everyone who is here today, thank you, the audience, for your time and your engagement, and have a great rest of your day. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Nice seeing you, Sherri.
Thank you. Nicely done. Good to see everyone.